Hi, I'm James of the Boone Boys, and I am going to tell you everything that you need to know about winter dead stick fishing for hybrid bass, striped bass, and white bass. We are going to go over baits, we're going to go over jig heads and weights, we're going to go over poles, and also tips and techniques. So after watching this video, you'll know everything that you need to know to go out and have success this winter dead stick fishing. Let's get going. Before starting, you may not know what dead stick fishing is. What dead stick fishing is, in the wintertime, typically when water temps get below 60 degrees, take a jig and a jig head like this, put it over, and hold it completely still as you can, hence dead stick. Typically, when you dead stick fish, you want the water temperature to be below 60 degrees. Low 50s, upper 40s are probably the best. I've actually caught fish dead sticking in low 60s, typically mid 60s and above. Live bait is king, and that's typically when we have our bait tank in our boat. But when the water temperature gets below here in Oklahoma, typically it's late November all the way through January and February, we almost exclusively dead stick fish. So let's talk about the jig head weight. The weight is very, very important. The reason is for this. You want your bait to be very consistent at the bottom. So right here is an 1.5 ounce jig head. This is the most common jig head size that we use for winter dead stick fishing. Now, it's very common, a 1 ounce as well. If it's a really calm day and you're not moving that fast with your trolling motor or drift fishing, then 1 ounce will be okay. The problem is, if it's really windy, this 1 ounce will really get off the bottom as you start drifting really, really fast. We also have a 2.5 ounce option. Now, this option is not as common. Now, if the winds are blowing 25 to 30, you are gonna need a 2.5 ounce jig head. Dead stick fishing on windy days, I've actually put a egg sinker on top of the jig head to keep it down as close to the bottom as possible. So it's really important to have weight sizes, whether it be 1.5 ounce, 2 ounce, and 2.5 ounce, with 1.5 ounce being the most common jig head size that you will use. Let's talk about hook sizes. Typically, I use a 5/0 hook. Now, these vary between brands of hooks that you get and companies like Bulldog Baits or Precision Jig Company. Here's an example right here of something that I got off eBay. Now, this was supposed to be a 5/0 hook. Check out this compared to this 5/0 hook. Look how much longer that this hook is. I'm not a fan of the long hooks like this. The reason is I just don't feel like they get as good of hook set, especially if you're catching smaller fish. Now, if you're catching bigger fish, you probably won't have a problem with this longer jig head like this, or if you're striper fishing where they have a little bit bigger mouths than white bass or hybrid bass. But typically for hybrid bass and striped bass, the 5/0 hook is probably your go-to. There are times where 4/0, if you can see the difference between these hooks, does come into play. If you're catching some white bass or it's a mixture between hybrid bass and white bass, it is a lot better, obviously, to have a little bit smaller hook because you will get a lot of hits and miss them if you're in some white bass and you're using too big of a hook. Overall, if you're just gonna get some standard jig heads to go hybrid bass fishing, white bass, striped bass, 5/0 hook is the way to go. Now, let's talk about colors. Typically, I'm a big fan of white. I'm a big fan of yellow, chartreuse. Pink is a great color. Day in, day out, white is probably my go-to. So if you're gonna buy some jig heads, I would suggest maybe buying more white than you would any other color. This green one from Bulldog Baits did really, really well last year. But what I found is colors come and go. Every year seems to be a little bit different which jig head makes a difference. Does it make a difference? Absolutely, it makes a difference. One tip I would give you when you go to the lake, use different jig head colors to start with to find out which one the fish are hitting best, because they do make a big difference. Sometimes this purple right here with little sparkles will be it. Sometimes it's just green, and sometimes it's just a plain white jig head. So make sure when you go to a new lake or you're first starting for the season, have different jig head colors because they do matter. Let's talk about bait, brands, and also colors. But first with the brand, I use Zoom Flukes and Z-Man 10X. Both of them have their pros and cons. The Zoom Flukes are gonna be a little bit stiffer of a bait, and you're gonna go through a lot more of them if you're catching a lot of fish. The 10X with the Z-Man, they're gonna be a lot more flexible, and honestly, I've had these go through 30, 40, 50 fish with one bait. Now, sometimes the stiffness matters, right? So if you're in the water and sometimes like if it's not drooping or your bait's not moving as much, sometimes that will create a bite. So I like to carry both of these because I think sometimes the Zoom Flukes are working better than the 10Xs. If a Z-Man 10X is working, I really like it because you don't have to worry about changing baits as often. They usually last so long, and just a great bait. One caution. If you are using Z-Man 10X baits, do not leave it on the hook and allow it to touch other baits or plastic. If this Z-Man bait touches these baits, it will melt them. That is one word of caution. Make sure after you get through using a Z-Man bait that you put it back in the package. That's also could be a con for you. With the Zoom Flukes, it doesn't matter. You can keep them in your rod box or keep them out all year round. It really doesn't matter. My two favorite colors on the 10X baits are the Electric Chicken and then the Chartreuse. You cannot go wrong with these baits. Electric Chicken and Chartreuse, year in, year out, these are usually very consistent colors. On the Zoom Fluke, the Bourbon Blaze, some years, this is probably my best bait. Some years, it's not so good. The White Pearl and Chartreuse Tail, last year, for instance, this was not a good bait. 2 years, this was probably the best bait, but this is a good color to add. The Watermelon with Red Flake on the Zoom Fluke, this is a good color. There are some days, it depends on the light, this might be the best bait in the box. The Midnight Chartreuse arguably is one of my favorite baits, especially whenever the sun starts getting a little bit low or if it's overcast. This just seems like it's one of the best baits. A guide on Texoma actually led me to this color, and it has been one of the most consistent colors for years now. Bubblegum seems to be hit or miss. Sometimes it is the best bait. Sometimes, you know, you catch one and the other guy's catching 5 with the Midnight Chartreuse. With all that being said, colors are so important with a jig head, but most importantly, it's important with the Fluke or the Z-Man bait. So make sure that you have multiple colors in your box and start the day using different colors, because I'm telling you what, one day the white and chartreuse could be working, the next day the hot chartreuse, and the next day maybe the bubblegum. It just depends on the day. So make sure you at least start with these baits in your boat. Let's talk about scents. These aren't very common, and maybe you be a little bit superstitious, or they might work, they may not. It just depends. I use them. Okay, here's a shad scent and here's a crawfish scent. I've done some videos on this. Actually, a video, I think we caught 10 or 15 fish before my dad actually caught a fish. Me and Jeremy were using these, and we didn't tell my dad about it, and he didn't even hardly catch a fish.
I have scent.
We have scent, they don't. We've got to let them know, because this is just, it's getting to the point of being wrong. This is what we've been using, man. Shad scent. On both these poles over here. The only poles catching fish. Take it or leave it. I have them in the boat. It's one of those things. Why not? It's definitely not going to hurt you. So next, let's talk about rods. I typically use a 7-foot or a 7.5 foot medium heavy for dead stick fishing. You can use medium light. This is a medium light. We crossover fish all this rigs from live bait to dead stick fishing, so we do have some medium lights in the boat, but medium heavy is what you want. The reason is you want some backbone when you're setting the hook. A lot of times when they hit it, it is so soft you'd almost feel like a crappie's biting it, but you might have a 10-pound hybrid bass or striped bass hitting it and it's light. You want to set that hook immediately without any delay. That is why medium heavy is my go-to. I've done a video on the ugly stick striper and catfish that I'll put in the description below. These are arguably the best bang for your buck in any pole that you can get out there. $49.99. I mean, it is insane how cheap these are, and these poles are incredible. This is a bass rod and a bass setup right here. This is perfectly fine for dead stick fishing. Now, if you're live bait fishing, we do not use this. It's just not the best setup. But for dead stick fishing, they're a little bit more lethargic than they are in the summertime with live bait fishing, and this will handle them just fine. This is a medium heavy, ugly stick elite, and then just a normal bass reel right here. This will handle them just fine dead stick fishing. Let's talk about lines. Typically you want to use a braided line. This is actually kind of a white and black line here. It's kind of a unique line to this reel right here. I do great on this. Most of all our other rods have kind of a greenish line on it. The reason why you want to use braid is for the hook set and a quick hook set. You do not want to delay, because they will hit it and spit it out before you even know it. But I'm gonna hit on that in a little bit, whether you hold the pole or you put the pole in the pole holder. Both those go into factor, but braided line is the best way to go. Now, if the fish are finicky and you're not certain, I do have 2 or 3 rods always rigged up with fluorocarbon, with about 20 foot of fluorocarbon, and then I've got braid behind it. Sometimes in some lakes, this matters a lot. You will catch 10 fish if someone has 1 fish with braid in some lakes, in some scenarios. A good example is we're fishing Lake Texoma, which is a striper lake, and my dad was using a yellow line that we typically use for catfish, and he wasn't catching any fish the whole day. It didn't even dawn on me that he had yellow line. I gave him a new pole. Immediately he started catching fish. Line matters. But typically where we fish, 25 to 30 pound braid, that's about an 8-pound diameter, is perfect. In saying that, we always use some poles that have some fluorocarbon because sometimes they are catching more fish than the braided. Now, if you're gonna use a leader, a fluorocarbon, 25 pound-ish, if you have seen any of our videos when we're live bait fishing, we always use the 30-pound leader. You can get by with a smaller leader because it's gonna be longer. It's gonna be 20 foot instead of a 2-foot leader. So 25 pound or so, typically you will not break those off. You could probably even go down a little bit more if you're working the fish. You know, you don't mind tangling up the whole boat and really not horsing them. So I'm gonna give you a pro tip right here. I learned this from my Uncle Tim. How you rig your bait. Typically, like you would think, you rig your bait where it's like a normal fluke where you're just threading it through the hook, okay? I'm telling you, sometimes if you hook it upside down, see the gap right there? If you hook it upside down, it hangs just a little bit different. It's not much, it hangs a little bit different in the water, and it's gonna give it a little bit more flexibility. If you notice that, because not as much of this is hooked as it is here, gives it more flexibility. I'm telling you what, I've seen it where my Uncle Tim, granted, he arguably might be the best fisherman in Oklahoma, but he will hook them upside down. I think he didn't mean to, but I'm telling you, well, he'll catch 5, 10 fish to my 1 or 2. Sometimes this matters. Just keep that in your back pocket. If you're struggling, flip that fluke or that Z-Man bait upside down and it could get you more fish. Now let's talk about thumpers and splashers. I've done videos on both of these products. I always use a splasher year round. Now the thumper is typically what I use exclusively in the wintertime when we're in greater than 20 foot of water. But every time we go out dead stick fishing, I use a thumper. Now again, I'll put those videos in the description below. You can learn all about those. But if you do not have a thumper or a splasher, you're gonna wanna get one. And if you're dead stick fishing, you definitely wanna go get a thumper. I'm telling you what, they make a huge difference. Let's talk about boat speed. This is so important because every day is a little bit different, and honestly every year it seems like it's a little bit different. My sweet spot with the boat movement is about 3 to 4/10 miles an hour. Now we drift fish and we use a trolling motor. Most of the time I use a trolling motor on the lakes that I fish, and I typically go 3 to 4/10. Sometimes the days are 7/10. It just depends on the day. Not as common do we spot lock. Those days are awesome that you can spot lock and they stay around you, but a lot of times the fish are feeding and then they're gone. And then you're just sitting there if you're spot locked and you're waiting for fish to kind of pass by. So it's always best just to keep on the move. Even if you're on them, a lot of times I just keep rolling. About 3/10, 4/10. Occasionally, if everybody gets a fish, I'll put spot lock and we may fish an area. I've had it where we've caught a limit spot locked. But most of the time, you're gonna want your boat moving about 3/10, 4/10, 5/10 miles an hour. Anything above 7/10 is really fast, and that's when you're gonna want this 2.5 ounce weight to keep that on the bottom. If you've made it this far in the video, you're the lucky one, because this is actually gonna be the best tip I can give you dead stick fishing. Because I know several people that don't do this right, and they'll go out there and catch maybe 1 fish, 2 fish, and if you do it right, you might catch 20, 30, 40 fish. It's that big of a difference. Now, when you're dead stick fishing, you want to hold the pole. It is huge. Now, what they call it, whenever you put the pole in the pole holder, they call that suiciding. My wife doesn't like that term, but that's just what they call it. That's where you just put it in the pole holder, reel it up 2 cranks, and just let it go. And if they hit it and it hooks himself, great. I'm here to tell you, I have been fishing where a suicide pole is out and it's caught no fish, and other people in the boat have caught 20, 30 fish. It is that big of a difference. You want to hold the pole because these fish some days will bite so soft and they'll spit it out before you even know it. Now, some days you can catch quite a bit of fish depending on how they're biting with your pole in the pole holder, because they're moving really fast as they're biting and they'll hook themselves. But most of the days you want to hold your pole. This is the next big reason you want to hold your pole, because you want to keep your bait as still as possible. Here's an example. Once you get your bait up 2 reels from the bottom, typically we keep our bait about 2 reels off the bottom. That's roughly about 3 to 4 feet off the bottom. Now, this is what's really important. If the days are windy and your boat's moving, this is what your lure's doing in the water. Like this. That's what it's doing. Just like that. It's going everywhere. If you're holding the pole, you want to move with the waves with your pole, right, as you go up and down like this, so your bait will stay as still as possible. Now, when the bait's in the water, obviously it's gonna float a little bit more. And some days you don't want this action where that tail's going like this and it's going up and down. It will cost you fish. So most of the time when I'm fishing, I will hold the pole, and if it's windy, I'll move the pole up and down to try to keep my bait as still as possible. This is key, guys. I'm telling you, if you don't learn anything else from this video, it's hold your pole and keep your bait as still as possible. If you're struggling catching fish, or you maybe have some bites, or you see some fish and they're not hitting, occasionally you can drop your pole like this, drop it and hold it. Typically, if you're moving up and down like this, like you would slabbing, you're not gonna get many bites, okay? But occasionally, you can get a reaction bite if you just do a short little drop like that, and your bait just kind of flutters in the water. That's a pro tip. Sometimes you can bounce your bait off the bottom. Sometimes the fish are very, very finicky, and you go like off the bottom just like this, bounce it, and it'll create a little mud movement in the water like this, and you'll kind of get those hard to bite fish. Last year, there were several days that we only caught fish bouncing off the bottom, and honestly, I don't think they wanted to hit. It just made them mad, but it helped us catch fish. Do not use your pole on the pole holder. If you can, hold the pole, guys. I'm telling you, if you'll learn anything from this, take this tip, because this will catch you a lot of fish. Now, this next one's gonna vary between whatever lake you're on, but most of the time, we are 1-2 cranks up off the bottom, almost always. So you can see from this boat where I'm at, it's almost to like right here from the concrete here. That's how high off the bottom, because most of these fish are gonna feed up like this. They're not gonna feed down, let's say like a walleye. Most of them are gonna feed a little bit up, so you want that bait a little bit above them. Now, every day's a little bit different, like I mentioned, bouncing off the bottom, or sometimes they're suspended, sometimes they're, you know, if you're in 40 foot of water, they might be in 20, but most of the time, I've even seen it where you had fish from the bottom to the, you know, middle of the water column for 15 feet, and only the fish at the bottom were biting. So typically it's 2 cranks, crank and a half, play with it, but most of the time start out 2 cranks, and you can't go wrong with that. Dead stick fishing is so much fun, probably the most fun way I like to fish. It's unbelievable. If you haven't done it, you've got to go try it. But what I told you today is what you need to know to go out and have success winter dead stick fishing. I hope it helps you out, guys. God bless you all, and we'll see you on the next one.